Someone once said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capital. Why is that? What can we do to change that? Because capitalism is great. It's done wonders in terms of economic growth and raising quality of life for millions of people, but not everyone. And you can see as time goes by that we see more and more people left out. And you might have spoken with your friends, alternatives, right? And they bring up communism or socialism. And there's a million reasons why it's the best idea and a million reasons why it won't. Chances are, there's so much baggage behind those systems. People generally arrive at the conclusion that capitalism is the best system we have. And the point of this series is to suggest that maybe our problem is that capitalism is the best system we can imagine, which is big because science says that we need a compelling alternative if the old one is ever to be debunked. Right? So only talking about problems, critiquing capitalism actually only reinforces the narrative that it's the best we got. We just got to deal with it. So that's why we have this Imagining After Capitalism series where we'll distill what you need to know to shape positive alternatives to capitalism in your life, whether it be life choices, decisions, conversations. Now, I didn't do this research. This was a book written by Dr. Hines. He's a world-renowned futurist leading the Houston Foresight program. Spent over a decade of research, read over 50 books and reports, and gathered 700 signals of capitalism in decline, transition, and emerging alternatives. So the research is already there, and it's just about making it accessible and seeing what resonates. We're kicking off the series with 3 beliefs underpinning the inevitability of capitalism and 3 positive, viable alternative views that make imagining after capitalism. So, first off, some level setting. I'm not an expert in capitalism, but, let's have the blind lead the blind and say, and define it, right? So, at this point, capitalism is the operating system to help society function. And this operating system relies on private ownership of capital, being the things we use at work to produce goods and services like materials, machines, buildings, knowledge, the stuff that society needs to function, right? So private ownership of capital and allowing the market to determine distribution through supply and demand. So basically, just let the market decide what goes on. And so what we're here to say is that as society's operating system, capitalism is not good, bad, or inevitable, right? It's using systems thinking. One could say it's a system that arose at a point in time under certain conditions. So this is not the pinnacle of humanity. In fact, it's been barely 300 years, which is not a long time in the span of humanity as a species. And instead of good, bad, or inevitable, it's a losing fit for purpose. Many people might say, we can fix it. Just like a broken relationship, we can fix it. We'll go down that rabbit hole later. But what you need to know for now is that a system's behavior is a function of its structure. So what we see in terms of the outcome, the behaviors of a system is a function of its makeup, structure. What we see from capitalism is a small number of winners capturing a large share of wealth and having the losers fight for the leftovers. And from a systems perspective, the way it's made up, what that means is that inequality is a feature, not a bug. You'll see research, 86 types of capitalism. He names them all, and oftentimes people will say, don't worry, X type of capitalism will save the day. And the metaphor he would use is that there are many flavors of ice cream, and all of them are bad for our diet. So it doesn't matter what kind of capitalism it is, inequality is a function. Equality will always exist, no matter what type it is. All right, those out of the way, let's get into the 3 stories, right? So essentially my kind of interpretation, part of this from the book, but we can see hundreds of years of capitalism have created a story of what we believe to be true about human nature, about people. So if we don't change these stories, capitalism will remain inevitable. So these are 3 stories disguised as fact. Okay, number 1, people are inherently selfish. selfish. Our particular species of humans have existed for 300,000 years, and for about 290,000 of them, we were hunter-gatherers who were materially poorer, but much more equal. So people aren't actually inherently selfish, the history would suggest. We've been inherently collaborative, actually, and it's the system of capitalism that rewards self-preservation, right? And equality. We gotta compete against each other. So hundreds of years of capitalism has created a society that rewards self-preservation, right? Now, so what does the book say? Right? Well, the book would say that human values change. Values are an individual view about what's most important in life, that in turn guides decision-making and behavior. And there are 4 kinds, okay? So the first are traditional values, and you can think of this as following the rules. The second are modern values, and that's all about achievement, growth. The third are postmodern values, and it's all about asking, what's it all mean? What's the meaning of life? And the fourth is called integral, and that's all about making a difference. So, they've mapped these out, and they actually have percentages for the makeup for the entire world. Right, so the estimates are around 20 to 25% of the world have traditional values. Okay, so following the rules, you gotta live your role. That's the right way to do things. It's a reasonable rule to have. They're reasonable values. There's no right or wrong, no better than worse. Modern values make up about 40%. And so that has a lot of alignment with capitalism. Think about achievement, growth, progress. So the makeup of society in some way mirrors the operating system that they're willing to accept and work with and thrive in. The third, postmodern, make up 25 to 30% of the population. So we started seeing this value set emerge in the 70s, and now integral make up about 3 to 5%, right? And so that's all about practical and functional approaches, the right decision for the right time. Anyways, so this first story, right? People are inherently selfish. That's actually not the case. Even if it were the case, what's more, useful to believe, right? Human values change is the alternative. That self over common good is not human nature, but a stage of development. So humanity will continue to develop and shift if we're able to make it to this course of making a difference in people's lives, thinking about meaning and shifting away from material kind of goods like money, status, fame, all that stuff. Number 2, story number 2. One is economy must grow. Growth is good. It is fundamental to a thriving society. So the contradiction within this is that there are limits to growth everywhere in nature. So imagine if people never stopped growing taller and we just kept on growing, right? We would not be able to survive. It's not sustainable. We would die. We would be hunted. At the very least, we wouldn't have gotten this far. And there's parallels to that analogy with capitalism. Capitalism needs to grow, and it won't stop needing to grow on a planet with finite resources. The planet does not have unlimited resources. There's actually something called overshoot day, which tracks when we have used up planet's renewable resources for the year. Everything after is overshoot. So, and that's getting earlier every year. All right. I mean, it changes. COVID it got prolonged. So that's something. That means we can make a collective change. Anyways, so capitalism needs economic growth to survive. Why does that matter? It matters because as a society, we've normalized growth to the point where humanity is serving the economy rather than the other way around. On visual here, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So the logic of capitalism is to constantly look for new things to turn into a product and sell. Here's why it matters for our everyday lives, right? Because it's essentially commercialized it, right? Making a living is now labor. Nature is now real estate. Hobbies are now side hustles. Human experience is now data. It's starting to turn our everyday life and experience and language, and therefore how we experience the world, into a product. And so the logic of capitalism is that economic growth will continue forever, even at the cost of humanity. What we don't need is another critique, right? What we need are positive alternatives, right? And so now here's one concept from Imagining After Capitalism called the donut economy. Kate Raworth, it's basically an approach to how we could run the economy, okay? So think about a donut. Inside of the donut is the social foundation of well-being that no one should fall below. Okay, water, food, health, energy, right? And on the outside of the donut is the ceiling, an ecological ceiling, which are basically the 9 planetary boundaries that need to be maintained for the Earth to be livable and sustainable, that we shouldn't exceed. So stay within this donut and everything will be fine. That's a real thing. That's a real approach. And it makes this fundamental shift from this belief that the economy must grow to social and environmental balance. Right? And in the following videos, we'll really flesh that out on a plausible future and alternative to capitalism. But for now, let's go to the third and final belief. So third one is about scarcity. Right? So before capitalism, the idea, rightly so, was that there is not enough for everyone. We just simply don't have enough for everyone, so we need a fair way to decide who gets what. Well, what's a fair way? Well, jobs dictate who gets what. After all, you're contributing to society. And in fact, the more value that you add to society, the more you should get. Very reasonable, right? Except for what changes if you don't have scarcity anymore, right? So if you take away scarcity, what do you need capitalism for? And what's changed is that there's literally enough abundance for everyone in the world to have a comfortable life. Some of the research that Andy found, one of them citing this dude named Piketty, 2014, and it says, if income generated from global output were equally divided, each individual would have about $912 a month. And the World Bank sets the poverty line at $57 a month. Right? So that is a big difference. Right? Everyone could be above poverty, well above poverty, basically more than 10 times above the poverty line if we just shared everything. And how is wealth being distributed now? Right? Well, the inequality is inherent within capitalism. So if we see at the return on capital investments average at 5%, while economic growth, which is kind of a measure for income growth, for how much money you make every year, averages at 1 to 2%. Right? So the people who have investments, homes, businesses, all that stuff, it's going to grow much faster every year compared to how much money you make in your paycheck. And if we zoom out and we look at how the wealth distribution is, we can see that it's not the top 1%. It's actually the top 0.1% that hold 22% of the wealth, right? Which is the highest share in almost 100 years. In 1929, that was the last time that much wealth was accumulated in society, in the top 0.1%. The second level is the top 9.9%, right? So the top 10% of society, they hold almost 60% of the wealth. So from 2005 to 2014, the real incomes in 25 advanced economies were flat or fell for 65 to 70% of households, 500 million people. And the rest of the 90% of society, they gotta fight for the scraps. And why do we don't need to do that. This is an option, okay? It's this often unconscious story about scarcity, that there's not enough for everyone, that drives us, society, to keep a system that promotes inequality as a feature. Okay, so scarcity is driving how we distribute resources when that's no longer the case. Okay, we don't need to have one job. We don't need the 0.1% of people to be holding 20% of the wealth. Clearly have enough. We'll see if we get into it, but not enough people that benefit from the system have the incentive or values to change. So that's why we haven't shifted yet. So because who's more likely to be a high achiever? Someone with modern values, right? Achieve. And do they ever kind of question, do we ever question this story about scarcity, right? So now the problem has matured for humanity from scarcity to redistribution. All right, positive alternative rather than a critique. So how can we, what's a way, right, to efficiently and fairly distribute resources in a context of abundance rather than scarcity? Well, there's something called the participatory economic model from Andy's book that sets economic rewards equal to effort, sacrifice, and need as judged by their peers. Pretty fair, right? So power, or how much decision-making input you have, is in proportion to the degree one is affected by economic choices. So power is given to those who are impacted by decisions. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but at least in terms of work, right, they have these things called workers' councils, where every worker is a member of a democratic decision-making body for their workplace. And each member has one vote. So instead of a corporation that's owned by a CEO, top 0.1%, right, and just does whatever they want to you, layoffs, for example, we would have a workers' council, and they do 4 things, okay? So they get together, they plan and decide what to produce and how. They divide up tasks into jobs that are balanced for empowerment so that everyone has the confidence and knowledge to participate in decisions. They distribute income fairly between themselves based on any differences in effort or sacrifice. And they elect recallable and rotated representatives to federations for decisions affecting their industry. So workers' councils, participatory economic models are a path forward in terms of impact to shift away from the story of scarcity. There's not enough for everyone. We can choose collectively as a society to distribute abundance. All right, so what's the point? Those are the 3 stories. Point is to shake up the snow globe that contains how we see the world, right? How we see these fundamental truths about society are actually stories in disguise that formed over hundreds of years. Okay, so even our great-great-great-grandparents were part of this. And the big thing about this is when we think about the future, a future for generations that haven't been born yet, if we don't change or examine these stories, then the future will always be that way. Right? Capitalism will be inevitable. But if we're able to reframe and see that these stories, or rather these fundamental truths are stories, well, the thing about stories is they can change and we can intentionally choose them. And the futures we imagine can directly impact what we do and how we show up as people. I'll show you what that looks like. Right? So the old story, people are inherently selfish, thinking people only care about themselves, so I should too, or only care about my close circle friends. It's kind of like this metaphor of crabs in a bucket. Crabs are pulling each other down when they're trying to escape out. But if you have a new story, thinking, human values are changing towards the common good, and you think about that for yourself, right? What do we assume of people, and what does that mean for the quality of their lives? What if the people you encounter day to day aren't immediately selfish? What if we could have enough people work together in the interest of common good? And what difference would that make? What futures then become possible? Or thinking about the story of the economy must grow. For as long as the economy must grow, we'll continue to see at a societal level the commercialization of everyday life becoming a necessary evil. At a personal level, what are we normalizing burnout for? When did productivity become so intertwined with happiness? When did our hobbies become side hustles? So the new story, society coming first, just thinking about our relationship with ourselves. Right? We give ourselves permission to not work overtime, if possible. Be okay with spending time with loved ones, not forcing a side hustle and letting it be a hobby. Spending time in community. How we spend our time. Economy must grow, society comes first. That's a difference. All right, last story, scarcity. There's not enough for everyone. We need jobs to allocate resources, yet inequality of resources are at an all-time high. What does that look like for us, right? So if that's your story, there's not enough for everyone, then that can put us in this endless climb for a higher salary. And, if you zoom out enough, we're competing to be one of the few winners. And at best, we're saying, oh, I'll help people once I win. Well, with a new story of distributing abundance, that allows us to choose our game to one with no losers, positive sum game, where you can help people, you can just need enough people to meet your needs, and you can win by helping people, right? So if we're distributing abundance, asking for help becomes easier, shifting our attention, energy, and ultimately how we view success. Story shapes our decision making. Those are the 3 mindset shifts that once we're aware of them, we can cultivate them by living them small ways every day. Collectively, we can shift the story, right? And make the experience of living feel alive. So comment down below which story do you see most often. You'll see a link to After Capitalism in the description. Please go ahead and purchase it, support the author, spread the word, have a nice conversation. It's a win-win, right? Making your life easier and making future generations' lives easier. So yeah, subscribe. Next video is going to be on positive, plausible alternatives to capitalism. There are 3. The first is about the circular commons, right? So the economy used to serve society. Now it's the other way around. What choices led us there, and how do we reverse that dynamic?